A quick word before we begin. The subject of this episode of Discovery Debrief is Star Trek the Original Series' timeless classic, The City on the Edge of Forever. Originally written by legendary sci-fi author Harlan Ellison, it's widely considered to be one of, if not the absolute best stories that Star Trek has ever produced, regardless of the many mediums the franchise has crossed into. Today, June 28, 2018, we learned that the irascible and famously outspoken Mr. Ellison died at the age of 84. Originally, the instinct was to delay this episode in honor of him, and in order to mitigate the perception that we were somehow trying to take advantage of the environment and conversations created in the wake of the writer's death. After we released a statement to that effect, though, two people came forward and insisted that the last thing Mr. Ellison would want would be for us to delay a discussion of his work on account of his passing. From one man who knew him, he said, quote, "Harlan and I were not tight, but I can tell you without a doubt he wouldn't want anything more than for you to get the work out there and amplify the glow of his bright star going supernova." From another, a friend of this show and a major fan of both Star Trek and Mr. Ellison, he said, quote, "I think cantankerous, forward-thinking, badass, curmudgeonly human Harlan Ellison would tell you to release your episode today." When I still wasn't sure, this same friend added, "Seriously, he'd make fun of you for not doing it." To me, that is what sealed it. Thankfully, the rest of our panelists agreed. So this episode is dedicated to the memory of legendary science fiction writer Harlan Ellison. His voice, his brilliance, his indignation, and his spirit are not likely to be forgotten anytime soon, and that's before even touching the pages upon pages of compelling, thought-provoking stories he's left us with to analyze for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Ellison. I'd tell you to rest in peace, but with love and respect, I doubt even death could assuage your restless spirit. Now, please enjoy our discussion of Mr. Ellison's immortal contribution to Star Trek, The City on the Edge of Forever. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Discovery Debrief, a podcast that dives headfirst into the proverbial deep end of our favorite spacefaring franchise on the road to Season 2 of its latest entry, Star Trek Discovery. I'm co-host Chris Clow, and I'm joined, as usual, but also seemingly kind of rarely. This is a very special occasion because it's the first time that members of our bold panel of Star Trek franchise explorers have all gotten back together at full strength. So we have Rachael Clow.
Hey, Chris, what is up? It's me, your wife. Like and subscribe.
Zaki Hasan.
Howdy, howdy.
And Cicero Holmes.
I've got a sickness, and the only treatment is time travel.
You've been saving that. I like it.
Yeah, actually, it just came to me, man. That's what happens.
Hey, man. Well, it's been so long that I like hearing it again.
Right on.
It's good.
Right on.
Well, so after coming off of the last episode, which actually, as we're recording this, I literally, like 20 minutes ago, just uploaded our last episode. So our panelists haven't had a chance to hear it yet, but it was a bit of a detour. I ran solo talking about the history of Star Trek in video games. So I hope that those of you who have had a chance to listen to it enjoyed it. But we've decided to turn something of a corner for the next several episodes of our show, since we'll have quite a while to wait until we can properly gear up for Discovery Season 2. So one of the things that we've kind of talked about over the past several months amongst ourselves is diving into all of our personally favorite examples of the Star Trek franchise over the course of its 50-plus year history. So to that end, beginning in this episode that you are listening to right now, we're going to have a series of discussions based around our favorite single episodes. So basically, these discussions are going to have a primary emphasis on how the particular episode currently fits into the legacy of Star Trek overall. I don't think any of us have chosen necessarily any hidden gems, so to speak, so you don't really need us to dive too deeply into the moment-by-moment beats of our specific selections. One of the cooler aspects of this little sub-series that we're going to be doing is that we've each chosen an episode in a different series. So we'll actually have quite a varied succession of discussions with different kinds of subject matter and a whole host of different characters to talk about. But first things first, as always, when we have our full panel on Discovery Debrief, how have you guys been doing and engaging with Star Trek since we last got together? Because it's been quite a while. Zaki, start us off.
I have not. My engagement with Star Trek is this show right now. It's
All right.
I'm in kind of an in-between period. Although I get, you know what? Here's a tangential Star Trek engagement, which is that
Yes.
I've recently started watching the Hawaii Five-0 reboot,
No.
which has been on, since like 2010. So I'm a little behind on that, but me and my kid are watching that. And that was, of course, developed by Bob Orci and Alex Kurtzman, who did the Star Trek reboot. So
Yeah.
there's
And
your,
Kurtzman, who is a showrunner now on Discovery.
which I'm sure we'll be talking about in just a second.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Now, if memory serves, your broadcast order rewatch that you were going through with your kids left off at All Good Things. Is that
All
correct?
Good Things, yeah. So it is still there. We've put a pin in that, and when the time is right, we'll kind of get back to it. It's just been so busy with school and stuff that I'm kind of like, I want to like be able to sustain it, and I don't want to be just hopscotching in and out of it. So,
Are you now? Honestly, though, are you kind of putting it off because you don't want it to be over?
I kind of am, and I'm realizing that because the finale of All Good Things is such a perfect way to put a bow on the Next Generation cast and crew that I'm, I almost think of that as a better finale than the one they ended up getting via Star Trek Nemesis. Notwithstanding your affection for that movie, Chris, but I'm sure you would agree that as a farewell, All Good Things is a better, like, see you later than Nemesis.
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't even presume to debate anyone who that's far from my mind. I mean, my affection for Nemesis doesn't really rest in its ability or lack thereof to give the TNG crew a proper send-off as much as it does. I kind of just like the idea of Shinzon, I guess.
Oh, sure.
But, I mean, we're going to have to do an episode on Nemesis at some. Obviously, you and I are going to at some point in the future get together to talk about Star Trek Nemesis. But I mean, I think we all have a lot of varying feelings about it.
Yeah.
Rachel looks angry now. I just brought up Star Trek Nemesis.
Every damn time.
But all right, well, you're going to have to keep us updated on when you actually do decide to resume things and when you're ready to let go of Next Generation. I know it's hard. It is difficult, but the sky's the limit.
I'll keep you posted.
Please do. Rachel, what have you been up to with Star Trek since the last time you were on this show, which was like a long time ago?
Well, I've been watching early TNG, like second season.
Yeah.
I got towards the end, like the last few episodes of Deep Space Nine. I realized I don't really like the end of Deep Space Nine.
Really?
Yeah, I wasn't really enjoying the whole, like, Cisco is Jesus
You don't like the
plot.
the tete-a-tete between the good religious figure and the evil religious figure that Dukat developed into?
I mean, that's okay. I just don't like that, like, Cisco's mom was a prophet, and I get tired of it.
I agree with you on that.
Everybody is Jesus. Like, come on, like, I don't know. It's okay.
It's Jesus.
Like,
Doesn't that sound like a
Jesus.
self-help book? Like,
Right,
it's
yeah.
kind of a self-help book.
Written by Oprah.
Everybody
You were Jesus.
Right?
Everybody is Jesus.
Jesus was Jesus. Not every fictional character needs to be Jesus.
Okay, fair enough. So, but moving to TNG has lifted your spirits a bit.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Always. I haven't watched some of the first and second season episodes in so long that they're very fresh.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why we're going to have to go through Voyager again at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Cicero, between now and the last time you were on the show,
Yes.
we got together to play a little bit of Star Trek Bridge Crew.
That is correct. Sir.
Between that and other things you've been up to, which is a lot, as anyone who follows Spawn on Me should know, especially just coming off of E3, how else have you engaged with Star Trek? And please do tell who you got to meet in Los Angeles.
So, all right. There's lots to talk about within the Star Trek realm for me. So I have determined that unlike Zaki, where he's doing the broadcast order rewatch of Star Trek, I've realized that I naturally, buzzword alert, I've organically started a broadcast order or reverse broadcast order rewatch of all the Star Trek shows. So I started with Enterprise, I went to Voyager, and now I've committed to watching them all in reverse. Next up is Deep Space Nine. So maybe not broadcast order, but release order.
You're right.
So I'm going to watch Deep Space Nine starting at the first day of summer. So that is, people behind the curtain, that's tomorrow. So I will start watching DS9 from beginning to end, and then I'll go, I think in the fall, I will start TNG from beginning to end, and in the winter ended with TOS. So, and then I will have watched them all or maybe I'll get the animated series in there too. So maybe I'll do that.
Hey, I mean, you'll probably blow through that pretty fast if I were to guess.
I could do that in a weekend. I've done it in a weekend before. So
right, sure. Well, that's interesting. So you're going to have a bit of a different perspective, and you're going to the thing that immediately comes to mind. You say you're going to watch Deep Space Nine because that show and let's say like season 6 and 7 of TNG, they have. I'm going to use another buzzword. Quite a bit of synergy.
Yes.
In some subject matter, particularly where like the Maquis are concerned.
Right.
And especially coming off of Voyager, you're already very familiar with the Maquis, but once you actually get through all those shows, it'll be interesting to hear how you sort of piece those stories all together after the fact.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
It's most definitely
going to be interesting. It's going to be very, very different. As you've already alluded to, Chris, I was just at E3. I was in LA and doing all sorts of things gaming. But on my way to LA, I was listening to James Swallow's newest entry into the Star Trek Discovery universe, the book featuring Saru, one of my favorite characters. Fear Itself. So I have not finished that, but I am deeply involved in that. And while I was in LA, I got to meet a personal hero of mine, and I think a hero of many of us. Some people know him as Kunta Kinte. Some people know him as Mr. Reading Rainbow himself. And we here in the Alpha Quadrant know him as Lieutenant Commander Geordie LaForge, or Captain Geordie LaForge, as he was.
See, I think of him as Kwame from Captain Planet.
There you go. And Whoopi Goldberg plays the same character in both shows. So
that's right. That's funny.
So I got to meet and take a picture with LeVar Burton, Mr. LeVar Burton himself.
Sweet.
It was really awesome getting to meet him, and we shared a room during a game demo. It was just two of us in there, or two. There were two game stations in that particular room, and he was watching his friend that was accompanying him play this VR game while I was also playing the VR game in the chair next to them, sweating and screaming. So. Yeah, so it was great. Shout out to LeVar Burton. I plugged the show. Maybe he is listening right now.
Oh my God.
Right.
I would lose it if that ever came to my attention. Well, Miss Burton, we love you. We love you very much.
We do very, very much, sir. So
now, well, that sounds incredible, and I know that you had quite a time at E3 as well. I did want to ask you just briefly about what your impressions were of Star Trek Bridge Crew, because you and I did play it before you left for Los Angeles. You played it on a controller.
I did.
But as far as just the game itself, what'd you think?
Oh, it was a blast. It was a blast. If you can get three of your friends, and even if you wind up with mostly random people, I feel like
we did.
Yes, I feel like the way the game is structured and who the game is marketed to, and the type of person that will gravitate towards that game will allow you to cooperate in a really, really good and succinct way. It was literally a blast to have. I shot off of my couch. I was blasting off my couch. I have not played the DLC, but you have told me some really, really good things about the inclusion of the Borg.
Yes.
And so I am really, really looking forward to the opportunity to go ahead and play that. But man, I had a lot of fun with that. And if anything, it has made me think twice about going out and purchasing the PlayStation VR helmet.
Well, if you do, let me know. But either way, we'll have to play together again soon, because that was fun.
Yes, and it is, surprisingly enough, a game that was built for VR that you can, which is amazing in and of itself, that you can play. You can play across PSVR with someone who's playing with a controller, and you can play cross-platform. So someone playing on the PC can play with someone who's playing on PSVR, can play with someone who is playing on the controller on the PlayStation 4. So all of those things coming together and it's seamless was really amazing. And the controller, the controls with the controller were not as clunky or as bad as you would imagine a game built for VR would be.
Sure. Yeah. Well, hey, I'm kind of surprised that Sony allows cross-platform play, huh? Hey-o.
Right.
Well, as usual, before we head into our full episode discussion, this time for a favorite, because it's been so long since we've all gotten together, there is no shortage of Star Trek-related news for us to talk about. So let's do that first. So, there's a lot here that I wanted to try and run by the whole panel. In fact, I had to control myself when it came to actually writing up what our discussion would be about, just because so much stuff has transpired. And but I think the biggest thing that we need to talk about right up front concerns some moves and shakes happening with Discovery itself, as well as the potential expansion of Star Trek in television. So first up, and I wrote this item before about a week and a half ago, Patrick Stewart came up in the news related to Star Trek, but the reason why might have initially required some decoding. In a video from Red Carpet News on YouTube, a reporter caught up with Stewart outside a theater event in London last month and was asked if he had seen the latest series in the franchise, Discovery. Stewart's response was curious. He said through a playful smile, in the way that only Patrick Stewart can do, "You mean the series and not the movie, because there is a new movie due out very soon. No, I haven't, but I may have good cause to look at it very soon." And that made my Andorian antennae swoop up pretty quickly. But this may actually tie into some of the big moves and shakes happening to Discovery, because apparently, as a result of their mistreating people in the writer's room, showrunners Gretchen Berg and Aaron Harberts are associated with Discovery. Not long after that news came down, we discovered that Discovery co-creator Alex Kurtzman renewed his deal with CBS, extending it, I think, about 5 years, and he's going to become the sole showrunner for Discovery. And CBS, this is the kicker, apparently has their eyes on expanding Trek on TV, which could include a new limited series starring Patrick Stewart once again as Jean-Luc Picard. So guys, we've previously talked in this show about the prospect of William Shatner coming back today as Captain Kirk, which we all don't really want to see happen. But when it comes to Captain Picard, I personally feel totally differently. How about all of you? Zaki, the return of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, or Ambassador Picard, who knows by this point, how do you take that? How do you take that sheer possibility?
Oh, I mean, it's hard not to get excited by it. I mean, I think, somebody made a comparison to like back in the early 90s when the original Trek crew was getting a little long in the tooth. And it's like, well, this is going to be just like that. And my response is like, well, the original Star Trek was a running and jumping show. Next Generation is a sitting and talking show.
Yeah.
And, given that that's sort of the paradigm that's been established, I don't think a 75-year-old Captain Picard commanding the Enterprise or commanding a ship, I hope it would be the Enterprise, is out of the realm of possibility. I mean, we saw Patrick Stewart in Logan last year, and he's at the top of his game.
Yeah.
And I think, just going back to what we were talking about earlier, if we can get a true farewell to the Next Generation crew, not above and beyond Captain Picard by virtue of this limited series or whatever they're planning, and why the hell wouldn't you do it? I mean, if you're CBS, this is a no-brainer. If you can make the dollars add up here, you talk about like, oh, we got all these subscriptions to CBS All Access because of Discovery. Here's a reunion miniseries of the Next Generation. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
It's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. I mean, especially because it seems like it's in vogue in TV right now anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, there was that sitcom that recently got canceled that was a resurgent 90s show. But then you also had, the X-Files come back for 2 additional limited series seasons.
Sure. Murphy Brown is coming back.
Murphy Brown's, 90s TV, it seems like there's a bit of a sweet spot when it comes to these shows coming back. Obviously, we've only heard about Captain Picard. I have a hard time thinking that there wouldn't be the other members of the crew attached to this. But, Rachel, Next Generation is often cited as your favorite show. How do you feel about the possibility of new episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation? Or maybe it's just a Captain Picard miniseries. What do you want, and how does it strike you?
At first I was like, oh god, they're gonna screw it up. But then I realized that the last thing I saw them in was Nemesis, and I did not like that.
They already screwed it up.
Yeah, so like if I could see them in something that's better than Nemesis, and that's the last time that I see them, it's pretty all right. Yeah, okay. I'm looking forward to it. I like the X-Files, and I didn't really care for this last season, quote unquote, of the X-Files, and
you didn't even finish it.
No, I just didn't like watching it. It wasn't good.
Yeah.
I think Gillian Anderson agrees with you, Rachel.
Yeah.
She wasn't a fan.
Yeah. And so it's like, if they bring it back and it's bad, it's not that big of a deal. You can't take away what we had. They can only add more good stuff.
Well, and with Star Trek, too, with the amount of legacy involved, and like you said, they haven't gotten a satisfying finale.
Yeah.
I feel like, and considering that especially everybody on this panel has enjoyed Discovery, it probably wouldn't be a terrible thing to imagine the people running Discovery giving Captain Picard a proper send-off. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Could be good. I don't know. I don't look forward to all the arguing on the internet.
No, that's irrelevant, though, for you. I mean, it's irrelevant to your enjoyment.
Yeah, I know, but it's just
it'll
a
happen.
thing now.
Yeah, it'll happen. Cicero, the potential return of Star Trek The Next Generation, or at least of Captain Picard.
So when I first heard it, I was like, oh no, don't do this. Are we at the point where Patrick Stewart really, can he move around well enough for him to be the lead in a show where he's a captain? He is some type of spacefaring explorer, which inherently implies mobility. And so that was something that I worried about. But then Zaki talked about him and Logan, and as an actor, as a thespian, he's never better. So he's only gotten better with time. And as we've been discussing this, I've been playing in my head with what the show could be. And a show where Ambassador Picard is going around brokering deals with different species and different alien races is a show I'd watch, definitely. So the misadventures of Ambassador Jean-Luc Picard sounds like the wonky follow up to Benny Hill that I never knew I wanted. So let's do it.
Well, yeah, man. And I mean, just as far as like a personal wish list goes, not that it means anything, I don't think John Delancey's very busy these days.
Yeah.
Give him one more go around too, because those two together that's just gold. It is. And CBS will print money if that happens. But I mean, I listened to I read a portion of an interview with Patrick Stewart where he said that he hasn't really been acting very much. Like, he's actually starting to feel that his age is working against him. And first of all, shame on Hollywood for not taking as much advantage as you possibly can of an actor of his caliber. But it also seems like there might be just enough distance now between the last time that he did play Jean-Luc Picard, who's a character that Patrick Stewart does have affection for. And he always took a stake in seeing where Captain Picard would go just as a character. So this is something that you're never going to convince me that we can't use Captain Picard in 2018. That's always going to be a possibility, especially considering that I didn't even think that this was at all possible a week ago. If there's just the slightest possibility of this, and it's just a rumor right now, nothing's confirmed, there's no guarantee this is going to take place, but if there's just the slightest possibility, there's slightest crack in the door, bust the damn door down and do this. That's what I say.
I also feel, Chris, like there if it's gonna happen, it needs to happen right now or very soon. I feel like there's a window.
Absolutely.
It's like a very narrow window to do it and do it right.
Definitely.
Yeah. And, well, so Patrick Stewart's 78. Which sounds old to people who are young. But Anthony Hopkins is 81, and he's in everything.
It's true. It's true.
Like,
and hey, if Harrison Ford can be 75, 76 and still do Indiana Jones
and Han Solo, right, exactly,
and Han Solo,
yeah. So, let's get it.
Let's do it. Yeah, definitely. All right, next. I think all of us have made our feelings on Captain Picard clear. We want more of him. So CBS, since you listen to us so much, make it so. Well said. Well said. But speaking of CBS, although it seemed like kind of a sure thing a couple of months ago, the proposed CBS-Viacom corporate merger that would have reunified the film and television arms of the Star Trek franchise now looks like it's in serious jeopardy. According to reports in outlets like Variety, Bloomberg, and The Hollywood Reporter, different suits and countersuits are being waged in order to try and block the merger from taking place, as well as to try and keep board member Sherry Redstone from initiating an action that would make the merger easier to accomplish. Corporate news is boring, but because this could have potential consequences for Star Trek, seemed like it was worth mentioning. So does anyone have anything to add here? Do we all pretty much feel that you can count on these conglomerates to do the wrong thing every time? Merge when it'll cripple the entertainment industry, but wait, don't merge when it looks like Star Trek might be able to benefit, because that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah.
No, you summed it up.
Yeah. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. Yep. Although I will say that this, if there is one good thing that has come out of this administration, the current administration that we have in the United States, is that mergers seem to be easier to accomplish with this administration in power than they've been since they have been monopolies. So I won't necessarily, while it looks bleak right now, I would not close the door to this merger happening.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it sounds like the FTC isn't going to challenge the AT&T Time Warner thing that's likely to go through. And now we just heard that, Disney has outbid Comcast for 20th Century Fox. So if you can count on these giant blobs to blob larger, then now is the perfect time to do it.
And Cicero, by the way, one other good thing that's come out of this administration is that it's made Khan Noonien Singh seem like not such a bad option. Like, he did offer the world order. That's something.
That is true.
Oh man, you have to laugh to keep from crying. Anyways, how about something brighter on the horizon? Let's talk about toys.
Oh, yeah.
We haven't talked a lot about toys on this show, but as most people know all too well, a franchise's health can likely be gauged by how many licensed consumer products are readily available for fans to buy. We got a pretty interesting and in-depth look at Star Trek's rather spotty history on this front when Season 2 of the Netflix series The Toys That Made Us devoted its premiere episode to Star Trek. Have you guys seen that?
A part documentary series about the toys that we all know.
Yes, exactly. Beautiful. So Rachel and I watched it, and I have to tell you that being a kid in the 90s, I didn't realize how great I had it when it came to Star Trek toys. Because my brother had an army of TNG stuff, including the bridge playset, the transporter room playset that showed your figures vanish. He had the Generations engineering playset that you could actually hook up to the bridge playset and open the turbolift doors with your finger and just, walk them into engineering. And I had that sweet 25th anniversary TOS box set that Zaki and I have talked about before. So It seems like Playmates kind of provided the golden age of Trek toys, but it was also a really cool stroll down memory lane. Maybe a little too much comparison to Star Wars, but Zaki, what did you think of it? Because I know that you generally get plugged into that kind of stuff in a similar way that I do.
Yeah, it's funny because I got like 10 years on you, so you never got to experience the dark ages of the 80s where everyone else had their Star Wars. You had your pick of like 50 different Han Solos, but if you wanted a Captain Kirk, like I was like too young to buy the motion picture toys. Because I was born like 2 months before that movie came out. And so basically throughout the entire, like I wanted original series toys for most of the 80s and I didn't have them. And so the 25th anniversary box set or whatever it was that Playmates put out of the original crew, that was the first time I got a Captain Kirk figure. And I was like, 14, 15. So I was like too old I was too old to play with it. Like I bought it and displayed it, but it's like, man, that's why I bought that set for my kids. I'm like, you're gonna play with this stuff. I didn't get the chance. Play now, Dad. I just want to eat. Play.
You don't know. Oh man. Yeah, you're right. Well, and that just kind of emphasized even more how the licensees they didn't know what they were doing. Especially in those early days, there's that god-awful helmet that had Spock on the front of it and like a siren on the top of the head. And it was just like,
what though? I need that to be brought into canon somehow.
Yeah.
You know how like Brian Bendis is working Nuclear Man from Superman?
Yes, I just saw that.
I need somebody to do that with the Star Trek Spock space helmet.
That would be pretty cool. Well, hey, Discovery, You're gonna have Spock, right? Well,
the first time you see him,
maybe he does.
It's Zachary Quinto in a helmet with a siren on the top. All right, sign me up. Sign me up. Definitely.
Yep. Cicero, what did you think about it when you watched it?
It's funny that you talk about how there was a little bit of too much comparisons between that and Star Wars. I understand that qualm, that quibble, but really, honestly, Star Wars was the juggernaut.
Oh yeah,
that was the thing that proved you can make action figures, especially at that size.
Yeah.
6.5 inches,
right?
And create an empire out of it, and of course, Star Trek, being what it was invariably, even though it was the sci-fi series that Star Wars, everyone calls Star Wars out to be, Star Trek was the thing that was always the step cousin. And as I grew up, as I was growing up as a young kid, and growing up in the 80s, the toys that you bought were G.I. Joe, Transformers, and Star Wars action figures and He-Man action figures. And while I love Star Trek, I never wanted any of the Star Trek figures because the merchandise was terrible.
Mm-hmm.
It was terrible. They had the communicator that was just a siren.
Yeah.
They didn't have actual phasers. Like none of the stuff that was actually used, and even the characters that you got, like the pictures of old Uhura were awful. Her hair was horrendous. Like that was an affront to Nichelle Nichols and black people at large. Like it was just they were terrible. They were terrible items, and you just didn't want to be the kid who came out onto the playground to play, whatever the game was with your action figures and pull out a Star Trek one, because they just weren't, even if people thought Star Trek was, even those people who thought Star Trek was cool enough for you to bring your toys out, didn't want to bring those toys out because the toys themselves weren't cool enough for you to bring them out and play with the kids who had Star Wars and Transformers and all the other
Well,
stuff.
and in the 90s, when I was a kid, and when we had multiple Star Trek series on the air,
Right.
And at one point we had 2 concurrent Star Trek shows and movies in theaters at the same time.
Right.
But as the kid who liked Star Trek more than Star Wars, and I love both, you can love both. It's not against the law, but I always personally gravitated more towards Star Trek. I just like those stories better. And even though it had been, a decade and a half since Star Wars had its last movie, I was still the weird kid, even though I was the one who was able to actually watch new material every week. So that is where, some of that old resentment kind of comes into play. It's like, stop comparing it to Star Wars. And in the 90s, those toys were really great. Like the role-playing toys in particular. I never had an original series communicator. It was actually kind of weird because I had asked for one for my birthday one year, and I opened a present for my 7th birthday, and it said classic Star Trek communicator, and I went, but it was the TMP wrist communicator. But it was even worse though, because I opened the box for the TMP wrist communicator, and inside was a Wrath of Khan phaser. So it wasn't even. It was
a nesting doll of disappointment.
Exactly.
Wow.
It was really weird. So I never got that communicator, and then it was only just this past Christmas that I got a real communicator that I can even pair to my phone, thanks to Rachel's parents. So that was a dream come true. But I mean,
that's how you chose correctly.
Exactly. One of many reasons. But it's just kind of
So it's interesting that you say that it was a Wrath of Khan phaser, because if you've already watched the Toys That Made Us season 2 episode 1 about Star Trek, and if you haven't, please go and watch it because it's really, really good.
Yeah.
You learn that they didn't even produce merchandise for Wrath of Khan.
Not at the time, no.
Because the motion picture didn't perform as well, and more importantly, the merchandise didn't perform as well as they had anticipated. So they skipped out on the good one.
Which is just weird when you think about it. To steal a phrase from Joel Schumacher, Wrath of Khan was far more toyetic than the motion picture was. So just very, very strange all around. But, well, there is a side note on the front of toys, though, too, because there may be a little bit of a licensing hiccup with the current rights holders, which are McFarlane Toys. And while they had initially planned to make Discovery roleplay toys like a phaser and a couple of specific action figures, Trek Movie actually caught up with Todd McFarlane himself at a convention after a bunch of pre-orders of the Discovery phaser were canceled. And he said that there's a disagreement between his company, CBS, and retailers over exactly which toys should be produced. So let's hope that gets worked out soon. But I thought that was strange because right now, the only Discovery phaser you can get is from a Novos, and I think it runs for like between $600 and $700. So having a $30 alternative would be nice, I think.
I'm not sad that we don't have one.
Neither am I. They just announced, Novos just announced a $1,500 replica of a phaser rifle from Discovery. I know, and that's, their full uniforms are nice, but they're like $600 a pop. So I don't know who's buying all of these, but screw you.
Right. Your landlord's taking your rent and buying rifles. Yeah, just like
fake phaser rifle.
I look out the window and they're waving
more expensive than a real rifle.
It is. It really is.
It really is. It's a lot more.
At least in the U.S. Yeah. Yes, oh boy. Well. All right. Well, so we do have a reason for being here that isn't related to possibilities in the Trek franchise. We're talking about history. And this is the first episode in our Debrief favorite series. And we're starting off with my choice for favorite Star Trek episode. So let's begin the discussion for Star Trek the Original Series, The City on the Edge of Forever. So first things first, I'd like us all to give our basic perceptions about this episode, because we've all watched it recently, and it's well known as one of the best episodes that the entire run of the original series has ever produced. Obviously, this was my pick, and the reason that I picked this is my favorite episode out of all 731 Star Trek episodes that currently exist is because of how well it establishes the cores of Captain Kirk and Spock, as well as how firm and solid their friendship is. But also, I feel like it's a wonderful example of how interestingly and effectively Star Trek can use real history for a presently relevant allegory and commentary on the trajectory of society and human nature itself. And that's probably the briefest terms I can put it in. So what do you guys think of The City on the Edge of Forever when it comes to your mind? Zaki, start us off.
Well, it's the GOAT. It's the greatest of all time when it comes to the original Star Trek. And there's a reason for that. I think it sums up everything that the show is about. It's about the camaraderie between the characters. It's about using the story for an allegory about our own present condition. It's about hopefulness. It's ultimately a story of hope, and it's a story of pathos, and it hits all those bases. And, I give all the props in the world for Harlan Ellison creating the foundation that the story is built on. But really, the unsung hero of Sitting on the Edge of Forever is Gene COON, who rewrote it into what we saw on screen. Mm-hmm. And he truly made it a Star Trek episode. I mean, for all of the grumpiness of Harlan Ellison being like, they ruined my story. It's like, they didn't ruin it. They made it a Star Trek story. And that's okay. It's okay, Harlan, to acknowledge that somebody else tweaked your story and to say, well, the foundation you built was so solid that it could still be great even after being changed.
Mm-hmm. No, very, very well said. Cicero, how many times had you seen this before you watched it for this, and how does it strike you?
Well, I probably had seen it maybe 2 or 3 times, based on my recollection prior to watching it again for this. And how did it strike me? To crib a phrase from James Carville in the wonderful classic film Old School. Zaki Hasan's answer was perfect. There's nothing more that I can say.
Wow, thank you.
With sans the Cajun and Creole accent. But yeah, I mean, it is a great episode. It's interesting from, maybe just from my perspective, and it might be just a perspective that I hold, but it's interesting to watch this episode in 2018 and think about 2018 sensibilities when you look at this particular episode, and as you try to kind of negotiate how much of what you're watching jives with today's society. And there were a couple of times where I was pulled out of it because I was thinking about it in today's terms. And again, my eye is different, as is everyone's eye, because all of your experiences are your own.
Right.
And then cultural experiences on top of that compound just the way you view things. So it was really interesting to watch it, but it was still a great episode. And if you jump back 55 years almost to look at, or 50 years to look at that particular episode and what that meant to be on TV at that particular moment, what an incredibly bold episode to have.
Sure. Very well said. Rachel, the city on the edge of forever.
Well, what can I say? It is a great episode.
Do you think that?
Yeah. I mean, it's really well put together, in that you have the, Kirk and Spock together. There's like a mystery that unfolds. There's sadness. There's so many emotions. You have the sadness, the Kirk falling in love, the comic relief of Spock having to kind of be hiding his identity and that stuff. This episode has everything. So, yeah, it's a very good episode.
Okay. None of you guys are trying to spare my feelings, right?
I feel like while I was watching it, my thought was that if they made this episode today, it would be a season.
Right.
Yeah,
they would stretch it out.
It could have been a season, though. Easily. There's enough content there.
Or they're stuck in the 1930s and trying to get back, and I guess that.
I mean, there'd be all sorts of, there'd probably be some temporal Cold War nonsense in there.
Fight the Zindi.
Yeah, but there'd be all sorts of things that they thought was the thing that McCoy was gonna do, and then McCoy shows up and it's the end of the episode. It's the button on the episode. And,
you're probably right. Well, so my next question was going to be where you think this one sits as far as best examples of TOS, but sounds like everybody's in general agreement with me that this is the best one. So, I mean, it's hard to quantify exactly what it is that makes it the best, only because being so far removed from when it first came out, it's probably a little bit difficult for us in the modern era to imagine exactly how revolutionary a story this was. But I mean, I saw a meme before we had planned on recording this episode that said, "City on the Edge of Forever is your favorite episode of TOS unless your name is Harlan Ellison." And I feel like it's true. Most of the people that I talk to who tell me what their favorite original series stories are, it usually centers on this one. And it's pretty interesting, especially considering that it's generally pretty far away from what a typical Star Trek episode is, while at the same time reinforcing the story tenets of everything that the series is supposed to be at its best. And I understand that Harlan Ellison, he did get an award out of The City on the Edge of Forever, but he still is very ornery about how the episode was messed with. And I have a great deal of respect for Harlan Ellison, and I'm not someone who shies away from or feels bad about the way that he expresses himself. I generally find his voice to have value, but as far as his ideas are concerned, I think that he's a pretty smart guy. But this story, if I had to think of another TOS episode that kind of comes close to it or is in a similar league, I don't know if there is any other one that sort of reaches the dramatic heights of this one. What do you guys think about that? Zaki, if you had to pick a TOS episode that was sort of in the same league as City on the Edge of Forever, could you pick one?
No, I think in terms of the sheer pathos that this episode has, this basically has enough emotional heft for the entire series. And that's not in any way diminishing what the rest of the series accomplished. I think there are better episodes that exemplify, quote unquote, Star Trek, the mission statement of the show, because this episode is not about going to, strange new worlds and seeking out new life. This is time trek, really.
Yeah.
But the reason that it is still 50 plus years later so powerful is, it all comes down to that final moment when Kirk has to stop McCoy from saving Edith Keeler, and you don't even see it. You don't even see it happen. You see it on Shatner's face.
Yeah.
And to me, our heroes are the most powerful when we see them at their most powerless.
Yes.
And a parallel I would draw, to me, this is Shatner's moment in TOS that's comparable to, when Captain Picard just starts crying at the end of the episode Family in the Next Generation, where again he's at his most powerless, and it's so beautiful and so poignant. And you can see, by the way, you can see the wisdom in the change that they made, because that was something Gene COON did in the rewrite, which was to make Kirk the active component in stopping her from being saved, because as written, I think he wasn't able to stop her, and Spock is the one who stops McCoy. And you see the wisdom. You see the wisdom of the rewrite because they made it a true Star Trek story.
Yeah. Yeah, as good a science fiction writer as Harlan Ellison is, he's never struck me as someone who has seemed particularly invested in what these characters specifically represent in the context of their own show. And having someone like COON, and I understand that Dorothy Fontana had a hand in things as well, at least in the writer's room. But when you think of the best Star Trek writers, those are two names that immediately come to mind.
Yeah.
And no, I certainly couldn't put it any better than that. It's such an effective representation of everything that you want Captain Kirk to be, even though he's not in his element. No one's in their element in this episode, but you see who they really are when you tear all that stuff away. When you don't have the bravado of the totem of the center seat, and when you don't have him necessarily able to order his crew around, and when Spock is struggling with what he has in order to try and make it as far as possible, then you see what they're really made of. And that's one of the things that I just really, really enjoy about this episode. And, you consider, what are the other episodes that people often cite as their favorites of the original series? The two that immediately come to mind for me are The Trouble with Tribbles and A Mock Time. neither of them are typical Star Trek stories either, but they're also not nearly as hefty as City on the Edge of Forever is. You enjoy those episodes more for, I guess, a fun sense of novelty, you know, friend versus friend with the bombastic kind of music going on behind them. Or look at that, the ball of fur is dropping from the cargo container onto Shatner's head, and look at him get buried in the pile of them as they gorge themselves on grain. I mean, none of that comes close to how you describe City on the Edge of Forever. So, yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting. Now, Rachel, one of the things that I wanted to ask you specifically is obviously the roles of women in television have evolved significantly in 51 years. So we can hardly look at the City on the Edge of Forever or TOS at large as a signpost of major progress for representation of women. But still, when you look at the role of Edith Keeler in this story and at Joan Collins' performance, how does it sit with you both in the context of its time and as an episode that you watched in 2018?
I mean, it's fine. I wasn't offended by it. Like there wasn't any like women can't be starship captains.
Right, yeah, like turnabout intruder.
Nonsense. I mean, having her be the, you know, most important person in the history of the world.
I guess you could make that argument, yeah.
I guess is good.
Mhm.
Yeah. Good for women, maybe. But yeah, I think it's mostly, honestly, it's mostly neutral. Like there's nothing like particularly heinous, but there's also nothing.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to ask you that is because I'm sure that there are things watching it that I would not pick up on as far as that kind of representation is concerned. But so you're saying that now it is still generally neutral.
Yeah, generally. I mean, generally I like to see more than one female character in something.
Maybe have them talk to each other.
Well, no, it doesn't have to pass the Bechdel test. It's just like when you have women, it's very much they're often in the men's stories as the a piece of the men's stories. It's not their story, right? And when you have maybe more than one woman, you get sort of closer to having more than like having it be a woman's story. So I guess in that respect, you know, this is not Edith Keeler's story. She is, a piece of Kirk's story. And so maybe I would like to have her have a more, you know, active role, or I don't know, maybe some more, have the story embrace maybe her point of view more. But I, you know, as it is, it's not bad. So,
okay,
you know, that's more of like a systemic, like that's like every TV show has always does that and has always done it. So it's like I can't, you know, I can't be like Star Trek. The 1960s Star Trek should be different than anything that has ever come before.
Yeah, I mean, largely, Batman's probably a bigger culprit of the kinds of, I guess, like objectification that you're talking about, you know.
It's not even necessarily objectification in terms of like looks or anything. It's just that the story is written, you know, by men for a male audience without even thinking about women, and such that the main characters are men, they are doing things, and women are parts of their story. They are, you know, your love interest or your daughter or your mother or an obstacle or like a sexual object.
Right.
And so like, even if they're not objectified, they're not necessarily humanized to the extent that
the men are.
Yeah. You're not supposed to relate to them. And in a way, like Edith Keeler, you don't really relate to her. Like, you don't understand why she does what she does.
So 5 decades removed, though, it's actually not bad.
No, there's nothing wrong with it.
All right,
that isn't wrong with everything.
I mean, because the thing that came to my mind when you and I had rewatched it was like the softer photography on close-up shots of Joan Collins. Like for some
maybe
reason,
Joan Collins made them do that. I don't know.
Maybe I certainly couldn't speak to that, but it was more distracting to me this time, and it seems jarring. It seemed jarring while watching it, comparing those close-up shots to the close-up shots of the other characters. But that's really the only thing that's why I asked you, because that's the only thing that like went off in my head about like a fundamental difference between the depiction of the primary woman in the show and everyone else, So.
Yeah, I don't care about that.
Cicero, you had previously alluded at the top of this discussion about like the cultural differences that are inherent in watching an episode like this now. What did you mean by that?
Well, so I am always kind of fascinated with one, Uhura's role, and the role of all of the people of color within, on the bridge crew, on the Enterprise, and this one there were a couple of times where I was like, oh, they brought Uhura along so she could be the secretary. And it was like, oh, okay, well, that's a thing. I do want to kind of talk about, or at least the way that I viewed Keeler's character. I did feel like she had some level of agency, and while she wasn't necessarily the main character of the episode, I would argue that she was the central motivation for the episode, and she was kind of like the vehicle that drove the episode,
right?
Things that she did, and then again, one of the things that attracted one of the things that made her attractive to Kirk was the fact that she was so headstrong, she was so independent.
She was kind of like him.
Right, exactly. And, that is a level of, agency, for lack of a better word, that you wouldn't normally see in television at that time, or really wouldn't see, except for, in very few instances for probably another decade on the small screen. So I thought that was pretty progressive. But yeah, it's funny, like as I was watching the episode and they're in the 30s, and I'm like, man, these people that are that are performing, these actors that are performing right now were barely children when in the time where they are actually, in this time period that they've gone back in time to.
Sure.
And so like that was, that was a weird thing to kind of put my head into. And, it would be like me traveling back to the early 70s or, or even the 60s. And, these are experiences that my parents know vividly. And, they heard stories of the 30s from their parents. And then they were actually in there and performing in them, and that was weird. But yeah, it's for me, it's always interesting to jump into a time capsule and look at a television show from 30, 40, 50 years ago and look at the sensibilities, both the cultural sensibilities, whether they be cultural based on ethnicity, or cultural based on the pulse of our society, our societal culture. And it was definitely interesting to witness it in this story.
Yeah, that's very well said. I mean, that is kind of one of the things. Well, I mean, just in general, I don't know about you guys, and we had talked about this a little bit in our conversations with Dayton Ward in the previous episode where he was gracious enough to come on. But I love how the franchise can try and fold in history that is actually familiar to us. And it seemed like City on the Edge of Forever was sort of the beginning of that. Obviously, we didn't really see the consequences of the history play out beyond the fact that the Enterprise disappeared at the beginning of the episode and they had to jump into the Guardian to fix everything. But, I mean, it started a trend that is one of my absolute favorites in the entire franchise. I mean, even sort of history of the future type of scenarios, like the one that comes to mind is First Contact, right? I mean, that's the past, but it's the future for us.
Right.
So there's not a lot of personal identification outside of like possible extrapolation with how things might look. And those kinds of stories, you know, I don't necessarily need them to conform to history as much as I need them to make the world feel more genuine and lived in, I guess. And City on the Edge of Forever was really the first Star Trek story that gave a sense of consequence to time travel. And it became one of the most often used tropes in the series at large. And when it's used well, I don't know if it uses it quite this well, but it can use it really well and make for some really solidly memorable stories. So that's one of the things that I feel is important that this episode set up, beyond all of the implications of defining the characters in the way that we know them. I mean, this episode is so informative to how we see Captain Kirk and Spock at large. Right. And it's just one of the reasons why I love it as much as I do. But it's hard, I don't know, it's hard to try and give service to just how important this story really is to the franchise, especially considering that it does not conform to the trappings, quote unquote, of a typical Star Trek episode. Zaki, what keeps you coming back to it? What is it that keeps you engaged in this story specifically as the GOAT in your mind? So you mentioned the pathos, but when you're actually in the moment watching it, if you had sort of a moment where you stepped outside of yourself and just went, man, that was really cool. Like, what do you think it is about this episode?
Well, a couple things. I mean, I think, like I said, you said it doesn't conform to the usual trappings of Star Trek. I think that actually works in its favor in that it expands the boundaries of what to expect from Star Trek. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it allows for, for example, something like Carbon Creek on Enterprise, or, all of the sort of format breaking episodes that there have been on Star Trek. But above and beyond that, obviously, like you said, the pathos is really the key for the whole thing. That's what sort of puts a bow on it. But, it underscores the future that they are fighting to restore. Mm-hmm. In that, there's an irony, right? That Edith Keeler, the future she envisioned was going to happen. Mm-hmm. It's just she had to die for it to happen.
Right.
Like, we had to plumb some depths in order to get there. And that's a very Rod Serling type thing,
Yeah.
And then completely separately, it's just, we get that great banter between the characters. We get, that rice picker scene, with Spock, And it, this is the stuff, there's a reason that we think of Kirk and Spock as a duo.
Yeah.
And it's because of stuff like that. And then lastly, I think, going back to how the story changed from initial conception to how it ended up, I think, the way Ellison initially envisioned it, where it's like, oh, there's like drug dealers on the Enterprise and this and that. And either Gene COON or Gene Roddenberry or both, they were like, no, that's not this future. Right. That's something that we can look at now. We're like, well, that's idiotic. But back then, I mean, the cement was still wet in Star Trek.
Yeah.
So they could have easily done that, and it would have fundamentally changed the future. It would have been the equivalent of McCoy going back in time and changing the future.
Right.
Like,
yeah. Speaking of butterfly effects, geez. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that is something that I did want to bring up, is that it genuinely amazes me how well this episode turned out, considering its very roundabout path to production. I mean, I don't know how deeply you guys have looked into what the original story looked like, but they actually did a really in-depth and solid comic book adaptation of the original teleplay it must have been about 4 years ago, maybe it was a little longer than that IDW put out. And that was really my first major exposure to what the story was originally envisioned to be. And it just, I don't know exactly in what terms to put it, but I guess it's just more cynical. You know, like you said, Zaki, the presence of drug dealers on the Enterprise, if I had to guess, that was a Roddenberry veto. Because
I'm sure
he always had such a clear vision of the fact, and he even put it in dialogue by the time we got to the Next Generation, that this is a humanity that has grown out of its infancy. You know, we're beyond those kinds of petty addictions and squabbles and interpersonal disagreements. You know, it made I know from Bob Justman's perspective, it could have made for some very boring TV, especially by the time they got to the Next Generation. But that's one thing that you can absolutely give Gene Roddenberry credit for, is the fact that he was so clear-eyed on what he envisioned humanity to be at this point in time. And Harlan Ellison himself, you know, we talked about it a little bit. He's a lightning rod. He always has been, and he always will be until the day that he dies. In the realm of science fiction. And some people find that obnoxious, and I find a great deal of value in his voice and his perspective. But consequently, because his version of the City on the Edge of Forever was changed so drastically, it's astonishing to me that the episode still managed to turn out as well as it did. And he seemed to seek to very much break the rules of Star Trek as they were established in the first season, because most of it was in the can by that point. And I certainly think his original story went too far in some places, but what do you guys just make of the messy history concerning what is often a revered outing in the franchise? Cicero, I know it's kind of a crash course as far as how crazy that this episode has changed, but just hearing all of this stuff, what do you make of just how well this episode seemed to have turned out?
Well, you know, it's funny that some of the best material that we ever have is stuff that almost, you know, it's the butterfly effect. If these two things had gone this other way, we would have something completely different. And, you know, and this is no different. It just only helps to cement the legend that is this episode. It took 10 months for this episode to actually be written. It was $50,000 over budget, you know. So I mean, for a host of reasons, this never should have seen the light of day, but it did, and we're all better for it.
Sure. Zaki, did you ever read the original teleplay or the comic book adaptation, or how did you first absorb the original episode? Or the original conception of the episode, I should say, because I'm sure that you absorbed that well after you actually saw the final product. So how did the clash strike you when you first absorbed it?
The first time I remember, reading like Roddenberry talking about the Harlan Ellison version, and he kind of bowdlerized what Ellison did. He was like, "Oh, Scotty was dealing drugs and all that," and Ellison's like, "I didn't do that, you dumbass." They were like throwing at each other.
Yeah.
Ellison put out a book. This is probably 25 years ago, and it was like Harlan Ellison, City on the Edge of Forever, something like that. And it was his original screenplay annotated by him. And so I read that, and that was full of all kinds of juicy gossip. And he talked about how Shatner at one point got a hold of the script, and he just sat there reading it, and he read it all the way through, and then he read it through again, and Ellison's like, "The hell are you doing?" And he realized that he was counting lines.
Oh yeah.
Which is like a thing that William Shatner was known for.
Yeah.
Ellison is like, I mean, he's like such a diva. It's very fun. I don't even say that in a bad way. I mean, it's very like rare, when stuff that he says. But I read that, and I enjoyed it very much as a science fiction story.
Sure.
But I said at the time, and I've never wavered, that it wasn't a Star Trek story. And it's like I said earlier, it's weird to me that he's been so hung up on that for decades. It's like, dude, the show because he started writing it like before the show aired, so he didn't really have a firm sense of it. By the time, it was like nearly at the end of the first season, right? It had turned into something like they had found their rhythm, and it was like, well, we got to make it fit with the vernacular that we've established. So, to me, every creative choice that they made makes sense for the fact that this is something that has to air in prime time, on NBC. Like that's not the script that Ellison wrote. So it's weird to me that he's such a sophisticated, intelligent guy, and it's like he can't get past the hurdle of like, look, man, they got to budget this thing. It's not a major motion picture,
Right. Yeah, and I'm sure that, I would love to know, obviously I doubt he would ever really be truthful about it, but I think that a lot of this antipathy that he has just arisen from the fact that the show is largely regarded as the best that the series has produced. If it kind of went off as, if it was perceived, God forbid, as like a by the numbers kind of Star Trek episode, then I doubt he'd be nearly as vocal about it. But Harlan Ellison too is very much like, more than any other science fiction writer I have ever absorb the work of, he is such an outspoken capitalist that, and rightfully so. He needs to be compensated for his work, and he's done a lot of favors to other writers who might be maybe too meek or mild to ask for the compensation that they deserve. But he is very much outspoken in that regard. And I think he's sort of grasped onto that. And, more power to him. It's a very engaging and interesting kind of story about how the story was changed. But yeah, I'm with you. He doesn't seem nearly as willing as he should be to bend to the realities of television, especially for a guy who has called television the best medium ever.
But in that interview that you had with him, it seemed like he hated television.
Right? Yeah. I don't.
He was saying how what they did to his script was sort of emblematic of television, in that they just water things down and make it.
He's a complicated sort of.
No one understands him but his woman.
Very nice pull. But no, you're right.
No, I just think it seems like he likes to talk a lot while he has people's attention.
Well, what was your because you watched that interview with me, because it was an interview that he did on an old talk show in the 70s. I think I had sent a clip of it to you guys too. You might have seen it before. But what was your impression of him just when you watched that interview?
He seemed like a D-bag, but like a lot of creative people are like that. That's okay.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with some of the stuff he said about TV, about it being kind of.
When he called Star Trek a cop show.
Oh.
Yeah, which I didn't really understand, but I felt like there was something about
it was very reductive.
The milieu of the 70s was different. Like TV was pretty different back then. I think he seemed to think that, like, or at least how I interpreted it, which is probably through my own perception, is that I think that TV tends to be very, like, uniformly better than other mediums. Like, TV is very people pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
But as such, it can be a little bit more bland or like more samey.
Mm-hmm.
Milk toast.
Yeah, and so it doesn't necessarily always reach the heights, and because it's not maybe as personal as things like books or music, which are like so like really intensely personal.
Well, and it's even weirder to think about it, especially when you put it in those terms, because TV as, a home delivery mechanism for art had only really ever been around for 20 years? Like the first commercial, like TVs that actually were able to show broadcast television was, I think it was like 1950 or 51.
Right.
Something like that.
Right.
So he calls television the best medium that man has ever created. But then, like you said, he brings up all of these shortcomings for it. I don't know how he necessarily rationalizes those two things, because he says he loves it, but he also hates it.
Well, then I asked you, like, if he thought all those things in the 70s, he must like TV better now, because TV is so much more segmented, and it does have higher highs, I think, and maybe lower lows as well, with all the reality horror.
You know, I wonder, because
stuff.
Well,
and you said no, he doesn't. So I'm like,
it doesn't seem like, well, because he
likes to complain.
have you guys, and I've full disclosure, I've never watched it, but it's coming to Amazon Prime soon, so I plan to. But have you guys watched Babylon 5?
Not, maybe an episode or two, not enough to say that I know the series.
Okay, Zaki, have you watched Babylon 5?
I have not, much to the chagrin of people who assure me that it's far better than Deep Space Nine.
Yes.
Oh, is that they're just
Yes.
drawing those comparisons right away, huh?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll give it a shot when it comes to Amazon Prime, because I've wanted to watch it for a long time, because I like J. Michael Straczynski in general. But Harlan Ellison had done writing for Babylon 5. I think he wrote more than one episode of Babylon 5, if I'm remembering correctly. But it seems like, I don't know. I mean, as someone who comes from the realm of writing sci-fi short stories, I actually genuinely really enjoy Repent Harlequin Said the TikTok Man. About the currency of your life being time. Like, you can pay a minute or two. And I guess a movie picked that up about 10 years ago, and Ellison actually did try to sue the filmmakers for stealing his idea.
Yeah,
he's a very litigious guy.
Starring Justin Timberlake.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I can't remember the title right now.
Out of time. In Time. Was it? Oh, yes, In Time.
I think it was In Time.
In Time, yes.
But, I mean, I genuinely, because I haven't heard him talk, because he's pretty old now. I haven't heard him talk regularly about what he thinks of the more serialized nature of television brought about by shows like Breaking Bad or Westworld or something like that. It seems to me like he would like that more, but he also comes from this sort of done-in-one mentality of short stories in a lot of his anthology work. Right. So I don't know. I mean...
Well, my point isn't so much that it's serialized. It's just that I think that when there were only, 4 or 5 networks, that TV had to be a lot
4 or 5
more.
Jeez.
3. I don't know how many. I was born after cable. So, but TV had to be, it had to appeal to as broad an audience as you could get, right? And I think that now, especially now, I mean, probably starting with cable, but especially now when you have cable of 1 million channels plus streaming plus YouTube, you can have TV for, every range, every taste.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it leads to a lot more range and quality, where you have things that are like Game of Thrones is 10 hours of movie.
Right.
Or you have, just a bunch of garbage on to fill the airwaves. I don't.
Well, let's start winding this down with a more general science fiction question, just because the way that this discussion has gone has me genuinely curious. With science fiction, there is a huge legacy on both film and television for great sci-fi.
Right.
Do you guys feel that film or TV is better for sci-fi in general? It's a tough question, I know.
Man, I would say that TV is better for good sci-fi, only because you get more of it, right? The variety of the variety of the breadth of television allows for many, many, many more types of stories. The frequency of those stories allows you to have an opportunity to have a City on the Edge of Forever type of episode that 50 years after it airs, 4 knuckleheads will get on the internet and talk about how great it is. Versus, there are there are definitely sci-fi films that are out there that do those types of things where you want to have really great conversations. I remember distinctly for a birthday, friends of mine, I moved away from New York and moved up to upstate New York in Albany. My friends came into town and we all got together and went to the mall and watched V for Vendetta. And, and you know, the entire way back, we were talking about the film and we were really engaged with the film and the messages that they were trying to convey. And, you know, and that meant something. But it didn't, you know, it hasn't stuck with me. That film came out, you know, 10 plus years ago. The film still sticks with me, but the conversations about that film and its impressions, although still very, very poignant based on, you know, current events, it still didn't, you know, it isn't in a point where we are having active conversations about it. And there are definitely films at the, you know, if you wanted me to rattle off 5 or 6 films that I could rattle off in the top of my head that say, you know, that I'm like, I really love what this sci-fi story was trying to say. And, you know, we could have discussions about them, but I think that there are probably 20 or 30, you know, ballparking television episodes where I could do the same thing.
Sure. Understandable. Zaki, if you had to pick one, could you? And which one?
It's hard to pick.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is, if I'm being honest. Yeah.
Well, okay. Look, Rich, do you have one?
TV.
TV? Okay, see, that's mine too.
Sci-fi is about world building, and TV gives you more time to do that.
And
I think that it just depends on the canvas. You know, the kind of canvas you want to tell your story on. I think that the world building aspect is important for certain kinds of stories, but you also have the benefit of scope with different kinds of stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean,
yeah.
Like I can't imagine Planet of the Apes working as well. I mean, they tried Planet of the Apes on television.
It didn't work, right?
And it didn't work, you know, and I think the reason for that is because you really needed the scope and scale of a big screen experience. Even though, in essence, when you think about it, Planet of the Apes is an extended Twilight Zone episode.
Right.
Sure. Well, and that's exactly why I would choose TV, though, because it seems like, especially, you know, in its heyday, cinematic sci-fi always had to be so big. And it really comes down to what kind of sci-fi stories you prefer. Do you prefer the big, giant, world blowing out ones, or do you want something that's quieter, maybe weirder, and maybe more personal? I think TV is better for that, and that's my personal favorite kind of science fiction. So, you know, it comes down to personal tastes, I think, largely. But okay, so I think that's pretty much going to conclude our City on the Edge of Forever discussion. To end this, I've got one more question for everybody. Of course, one of the major themes of the next several episodes of Discovery Debrief is going to be how we each zero in on what we believe are the best examples of the Star Trek franchise specifically. So as an idea or primer for people, when you guys made your choices, because you've already made them, what are the aspects of Trek that are important to you in picking out the episode that each of you chose? And do you feel like my choice conforms to that for you personally? Zaki, why don't you take us away?
Well, I think your choice is a staggering disappointment, Chris, and I've actually lost all respect.
We're very disappointed in you.
Yeah, it's just, this will be my last episode of this podcast. Because, no, of course.
I'll get the agony booth out.
I can't think of a better choice to get this mini series that we're doing started than City on the Edge of Forever. And I know, you know, the various other choices, and I love the diversity of the picks. And I think that the diversity of stories that have been selected show how elastic the Star Trek brand is, you know?
Yes.
So for me, I'm certainly not somebody who says, oh, well, if it's a Star Trek story, it's got to have this, and this, you know, I think, I don't have a laundry list of things. I think ultimately what I'm looking for is a story that uses science fiction elements to illuminate something about the human condition. right?
Excellent.
And Star Trek at its best is telling future stories about who we can be at our best right now, and City on the Edge of Forever illustrates that. And I'd like to believe that the episode I've selected is an illustration of that as well. So I just want to say I'm so excited about this set of conversations that we're having, and I really applaud you for coming up with this idea. I think it's such a great idea.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that, and I'm very much looking forward to yours as well, which is going to be episode after next. It's going to be a doozy. Cicero, what goes into your choice when you picked your episode?
So I thought that when choosing an episode, that it should be an episode that is emblematic of the series, of the best moments, not necessarily perfect, but emblematic of that particular series. So so that was kind of what went into my choice. And basically, when I closed my eyes and I thought about the series, what episode stuck out in my head, and that's how I chose the one that I chose.
Excellent. Rachel, yours is next.
Yes.
What went into the choice, and what was it?
Oh, well, should I say what it is first?
No, end with that.
Okay. So I have a weird relationship with Star Trek where I have like a religious relationship to it, and I think about Star Trek episodes as they apply to my daily life and dealing with just, what goes on in my head from day to day. And so the episode that, like, when I thought of my favorite episodes, I was thinking of ones that I return to again and again and thinking about and, like, helping me, like, sort out, like, the problems of my everyday life.
Okay.
And so the episode that I chose was Tapestry from TNG. And that is where, Picard, well, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But I think about that episode like an insane amount of time.
It's where Picard weaves a tapestry. He's in the ready room. He just wants them to leave him alone so he can finish his blanket.
And every time I'm weaving, I just think about it. But I think about it a lot. And so, like, well, I don't necessarily think about City on the Edge of Forever a lot as it applies to my life. It, if I had to read it in as if I were really reading a religious text, I would say that the lesson of City on the Edge of Forever for us is that sometimes when, things are bad, sometimes things have to get bad to get to a better place. And so the thing is that Edith Keeler was going to make there be too much peace, and so society wasn't going to progress as it should. So maybe with all of the horrible that's happening in the world, maybe it's going to lead us to a better place.
Very well said. Well, yes. So that is going to be episode 25 of Discovery Debrief, is continuing our favorite series by talking about Star Trek The Next Generation's Tapestry. I hope that you will come back and join us for that. But as for right now, that is going to do it for episode 24 of Discovery Debrief. We hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please like and follow us on our social media channels. And if you'd be so kind, we'd also appreciate it if you wrote a review for the show on iTunes or Facebook or Podbean or wherever you see it. It only takes a minute, and we'll be happy to read your review on the air when it's posted. If you have any questions, you can follow the show on Twitter at DSC Debrief, where you can also find all of our individual Twitter handles. And feel free to send us questions through Twitter, our Facebook-like page, or by emailing us directly at hailingfrequencies@discoverydebrief.com. Please be sure to set your courses for this feed for our future episodes, where we're going to be talking about a lot of some of the franchise's absolutely best Star Trek episodes, as well as potentially some guests coming down the line that should be pretty interesting, as well as at some point in the relatively near future, a review of the latest Star Trek Discovery tie-in novel that some of us are in the middle of reading right now. But as for right now, very much great big thanks to our panelists for coming together this time. And as always, until we meet again, please go boldly, my friends.